Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. This particular episode is about the art of role projections. It's about the hypnotic games that clients play, often unconsciously. How they often play these games to maintain and reinforce a particular self-concept, and how you can avoid being trapped by some of these games, and how you can even utilize them to help your clients. So let's talk a little bit about the concept of projection. There's two types of projections that you want to be aware of. I'm going to cover both of them briefly and then get into some very practical applications. Now, the first type of projection is the type where we have a tendency to, as Carl Jung used to say, marry our unconscious minds, meaning we have a tendency to take the aspects that are the least looked at, the ones we don't want to acknowledge, and project them onto something or someone out there with the greatest hook. So a good example of this is, for example, if you watch anti-war protesters, not to get political in any way, but some of the people that you watch in these anti-war protests are some of the most aggressive, hostile people you'll find anywhere. Like they're throwing rocks for peace, that type of stuff. And some of these folks clearly have a lot of anger and a lot of rage, but it's not their anger. So it has to be someone else's anger, or someone else who's kind of making them feel that way. So they project it onto something or someone out there with the greatest hook, which if you have a particular political orientation, it's going to be whatever war is being waged at the moment, and then you go fight that. Another good example of this that I sometimes see with clients is, sometimes when you get activists, environmental activists, political activists who talk a lot about saving the planet or saving the environment or solidarity and compassion and these types of things. Now, some of these folks, are probably to some extent motivated by, these things. Although the shadow side of this is very often that a lot of the people who claim to want to save and save the planet really seem to want to rule it. A lot of these people seem to be driven by power and status. That I've noticed this with quite a few of these sorts of clients, that in general they seem to be way more narcissistic than the regular Joe that enters my office, meaning that the more they talk about the common good and saving the planet and compassion and so on and so forth, the more narcissistic, entitled, and power-driven they very often have a tendency to be. This would be a great example of a projection. Of course, we're always projecting something, right? So if I point to you and I say, "You selfish bastard," there is three fingers kind of pointing back. So even though my claim "selfish bastard" may be on the mark or spot on some of the time, there are three fingers pointing back. There is an element of me saying, look, don't do what you want to do what I want you to do. So there is always an element of that. One of my favorite stories when it comes to this type of projection is the American lawyer Gerry Spence, who went many, many years without losing a trial. And if my memory serves me correctly, I don't have the case in front of me, so this is loosely taken from the reconstructive nature of memory, but you'll get the gist of it. I think he was hired to protect a black man who was charged with raping and killing a white woman in the Deep South. And what Gerry Spence did, which was so unconventional when selecting the jury, was that he would only accept jury members who admitted to having some racist tendencies. And a lot of people thought, Spence has lost it. What is he doing? How is he, he's going to get his client, convicted. And of course, Spence ended up winning the case. And of course, I don't know how relevant this particular maneuver was to the final outcome, but Spence showed some depth of insight into human nature when he was asked, like, what was that move about? Only admitting to people who had racist tendencies on the jury. And he said, look, pretty much everyone has racist tendencies. Of course, he didn't admit Ku Klux Klan members or Nazis per se. So he said, pretty much everyone has these tendencies. The most dangerous people, and this is quoting somewhat loosely, but the most dangerous people are often the people who claim to have no biases and who claim to be completely rational and completely objective and who just go by the evidence. And these people lack self-insight. They truly lack self-insight, and they often lack insight into human nature, or they're full of shit. Essentially, they're just lying and virtue signaling. Now, Spence's point was that the people who are honest enough or who have enough self-insight to acknowledge some of those tendencies may then also be more likely to have the capacity to give him a more fair trial. And I thought that was, showed some depth of thinking on his mind. This is also why, by the way, a very strong argument as to why, if you see clients for a living, you really want to do shadow work. I mean, your clients will help you realize where you don't want to look at stuff, because you'll often have the urge to save your clients or have a compulsion to help them, or I'll give you a fun example of this. I do my best with clients to help them wake up of the victim role that pretty much everyone to various degrees manifest in. But sometimes during the years I've been irritated when clients have been doing the victim role. And that's an example of projection on my part, because if I then go to the client and I say, look, you're pissing me off and you're irritating me with this victim crap, well, the person may still be doing a lot of victim stuff, but at that moment, I'm doing the victim stuff. I'm essentially saying, you're irritating me with this victim stuff, right? So I can either kind of compulsively attempt to change the client to feel better, or I can own up to that shadow aspect, mature as a human being, and be able to be more present in a flow state with that client and similar clients in the future, So this is there's another type of projection too that I want to cover here, and you can call it a functional projection, meaning that the way we use language is that we use language to kind of impose categories, linguistic constructs on the flow experience, which aren't really there in the flow experience necessarily. So good or bad, right or wrong, strong, weak, certain, uncertain, and of course, What we then often do, and I've called this the Nazi path to personal growth in my second book, Provocative Suggestions. But what we very often do is that we identify with one part of that polarity and call it me. And then the other part of that polarity becomes a not me, right? So, for example, if I identify with being a good person and a compassionate human being, for example, then if someone thinks differently than me and operates differently, I can very easily then project the seemingly opposite qualities onto them, because by seeing them that way, that kind of reinforces my identity as the good, compassionate human being. Or, for example, let's say that I have the identity of being smart or competent. If I have this particular profession that I have, well, it's really easy to then unconsciously use the clients to maintain that particular self-concept. So I may unconsciously begin to organize my client sessions and project a role onto my clients as them being vulnerable and weak and stupid and sick and not competent in some way. And I may use a lot of compassion rhetoric like talk when I do it. But likely the most self-serving motive for doing that is that the more I project onto the client the role of being the helpless, stupid, weak one, the more that reinforces my identity as the smart one. You'll see this in families sometimes. You may have a person who has the role and the self-concept of being the responsible one, and then they kind of project the role onto their brother or sister or whatever as the irresponsible one who kind of needs to be saved. And you can see how people sometimes play these games where the more the responsible one goes out of his way to save the irresponsible one, and after all I've done for you, so on and so forth, the more that reinforces the responsible one's role as responsible. And these are games that we all play, right? Politically, socially, in relationships. It takes some perspective-taking capacities. It takes some maturity. It takes a lot of self-insight to be able to spot these games, not only in other people, but in ourselves, and working on it so that we don't use our clients to maintain a particular self-concept, so that we can become more relevant to our clients. This is a topic that's extremely seldomly covered in any type of helping profession. It's more about techniques and formats and how do you do this or how do you do that, but there's often very little emphasis on who do you have to show up as to be able to interact with people in such a way that you're relevant, so that you're actually relevant for the other person. So in terms of the clients, I think it was Hippolyte Bernheim. What a cool name, by the way. I think it was him who had the quote, "It takes a wise person to know who's hypnotizing whom." And of course I reject the notion that anyone's really hypnotizing anyone. It's nothing that you do to someone. But clients, of course, have particular ways they want to see themselves. They have self-concepts and roles, and they will very often project onto us, the helpers, roles that kind of reinforces their ways of looking at themselves. And you want to be aware of that, because not all of this is equally useful. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One of my favorite is skeptics, people who have the identity of being a skeptic. So there's one thing, having a specific complaint. If a client comes in and says, look, I'm skeptical about this claim, or I'm skeptical about this idea, or here's a concern that I have, that's completely legitimate, and you want to address it, head on and directly. But then you have other people who, they don't have a specific concern. They're skeptics, right? It's their identities. And when people come in and they flag that identity, what they're essentially doing, albeit unconsciously, is that they're essentially saying, look, I have a particular way of viewing things, objective reality, of course. These guys don't have filters. They just see things as they are, and they're often scientifically inclined. So I have a particular mindset, and if what you say and what you suggest fits with that, then fine. But if what you say and do doesn't fit with that, I'm going to automatically reject it. Now, this is often problematic because it's their way of understanding and their way of viewing things that very often is kind of what's keeping them stuck to begin with. So they're kind of setting up the context and essentially projecting a role onto you and to themselves that very often, does a marvelous job in keeping them stuck. And of course, then they can leave the office going, I was too skeptical, for that stuff. So again, if someone comes with a very specific objection, I'll address it. But if someone comes with the I'm a skeptic identity, I'll often look at them, and say, a skeptic? Like a real skeptic? Cool. I hope you're a real skeptic, because I haven't had one in a couple of years. And I look at them with like a lot of enthusiasm, and they often get, somewhat taken back by that, because it's unusual. I say, look, most of the people who claim to be skeptics are fakes. They're not real skeptics. They're pretty much conformists. They're often very conventional in their thinking, and they've accepted the common mainstream view of how things work. And they're essentially saying that, look, if what you say fits with that, I'll accept it. Otherwise, I'll reject it. But that's not a skeptic. That's an establishment foot soldier. That's a sheeple. A real skeptic is, of course, skeptical of new information, which he should be. But he's equally skeptical of his own stance, his own way of understanding, his own premises. And he realizes that the only way he can really find out is by committing to having the experience and really engaging with an open mind. And then, and only then, evaluating based upon the actual results. So are you a real skeptic? Now, as soon as they say yes to this, you've projected a very different role onto them. I've only had one person ever say no, by the way. You've projected a very different role onto them where you say, look, be skeptical of your own stance as well and commit to engaging, commit to the process first with an open mind. And then evaluate based upon the results, instead of evaluating based upon whether something fits your current way of understanding or not. That's a way more useful frame, a way more useful orientation when you're doing actual change work with someone. Another really interesting thing when someone might call or come in and say, how long does it take? How quickly will this work? What type of treatment is this? That type of stuff. And the role and the mindset that these questions kind of come from is very often the idea that they have some sort of illness or disease and that you're going to cure them. And their job is to be a passive recipient of a treatment, and you're essentially going to do the work. Now, this form of passivity is very detrimental. So I usually say to them, look, you have to understand something. Change work is not like surgery. You're not wheeling your body into the mechanic's car shop and getting it fixed. It's not how this works. This is an interactive process where you and I are both active participants co-creating something together. Of course, my role matters, my skills, my competency, that matters a lot. But so does the concentration power that you bring to the table, your ability to listen, your ability to engage with thought experiments, your willingness to change, your perspective taking abilities. All of these things matter a lot. And the results will depend upon what emerges out of that interaction. Now, so again, this is a way of going from a fix me, do it to me type mindset to reinforcing a active, collaborative role. I'll give you a fun one with this. Sometimes if a client comes in for a second session and they lean back with a bit of that snotty type, distant attitude, and they go, no change, everything's the same, that type of thing. Especially if they do it with a bit of an attitude and like, what are you gonna do now? This is not a good place to be in. So if they give that to me, I'll say, well, congratulations. That's quite a remarkable achievement. I've spent over 2 decades doing this. And despite you spending 2 hours with me and me attempting to engage you in every way I know how, you haven't heard or seen anything new in any way that's significant. It's the only way you could not change at all. It means that you haven't really seen or heard anything new. So congratulations, that's quite a remarkable achievement. Now, you and I as a team have a challenge. I have to find some other way of engaging with you. That's going to be my assignment as a professional. Your job as the client is that you have to find a different way of engaging, a different way of listening, in such a way that you're actually able to experience, hear, and see something new. That's our challenge and our task as a team. Are you up for it? Now, once they say yes again, you've taken the whole thing from a surgery fix me type thing and gotten the client back into the loop, so to speak, as an active participant. There's there's a lot of these games that clients play. A really nice hypnotic induction that quite a few clients have attempted to pull over the years. More women than men on this one. A few men, but a lot of women. Is the whole "my ex was a psychopath" frame, which is a really, really devious one. Now, I'm not disputing that some people have what you could call quite a bit of, psychopathic traits. I'm not disputing that. And then some of these people may even have dated or been married to someone who had a bit of that stuff going on. So I'm not disputing that. But statistically, given the amount of people who have attempted to pull that frame, can't quite, be the case. Now, what you'll notice with these folks is that they come in and they say this, and the reality of it is they've often made a lot of like really shitty decisions, and they've engaged in a lot of self-deception, and they don't want to own up to it, So it's the "my ex was a psychopath" frame. Now, what they'll do is that they'll project all these, powers onto the alleged psychopath of how charming the person was, and how manipulative the person was, and how persuasive the person was, and how good a liar the other person was, and so on and so forth. And of course, the more they build up the psychopath in the relationship as having those qualities, well, by projecting the other person to be that kind of implies that they had no responsibility. They haven't been deceptive at all. They've just been kind and self-sacrificing, and they've just been completely sucker punched and victimized. Even though they may have 5 kids with that person and been with the person for years, right? They just haven't been able to see it. So what the client is very often saying is, look, don't treat me as if I'm accountable. Don't, treat me as a victim. I'm the passive victim who's been done this to. Now save me. Of course, this is a horrible frame, and you'll notice it that if you buy into this frame, that anytime you attempt to, get the client to focus on their decision-making processes, or what they're going to do, or how they're making sense of things, they'll immediately revert attention back to what the other person is doing and has done to them. And one of you is going to win that frame game. And if the client wins, you'll both lose, because the client isn't going to change at all. So the way I prefer to deal with this is that I'll say, look, the only person who's here in the room is you. And the only person that can really change anything here is you. So I'm going to exclusively focus on you and what you're doing. And I'm not going to treat you as a victim whatsoever. That's the premise for working together. And I'll just be really, really tight on that. And sometimes people refuse to accept that, and they'll leave or not come back or not really engage. So it can be a really, really tough one. With the way I'm currently working with the whole psychological illusion model, the biggest challenge is very often clients saying, "Oh yeah, I get that it's thinking. I know that I'm thinking, blah 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 blah," and then they turn around and they start talking about everything but their thinking, right? So yeah, I know that. Yeah, I get that. And then they start to talk about everything but their thinking, and this is a cool challenge. Of course, what these folks, the distinction that you want to help these folks make is the distinction between knowing what you're thinking and knowing that you're thinking. That's the big distinction that they don't get. So it's a bit like the person who's stuck in a nightmare. Yeah, they know what they're thinking, meaning they know the content of the thinking. They're being abducted by aliens, so they know that they're thinking about aliens. But they don't know that they're thinking to begin with. That's the difference. That's the big difference. So an analogy I've often used in seminars is I've said, look, imagine that you're Jason Bourne in a dream, and you're being chased through the streets of Prague by these Stasi agents, and you're hiding behind the garbage bin, and your body's full of adrenaline, and you're hyper anxious, and you may, of course, you know what you're thinking, right? You know that you're thinking about getting captured and the Stasi agents and stuff like that. You don't know that you're thinking, though. I mean, you may, as the character in the dream, succeed in changing your breathing a bit, or changing your focus, or questioning your thoughts, something like that. It may work to some extent. But you're not seeing that it's a thought, meaning that you're not seeing that the Jason Bourne character that you kind of think you are is fundamentally a thought. So that is a huge difference. So anyway, I hope these suggestions and this little rant of mine on projections was useful. Any comments, questions, feel free to leave them. Till the next time, have a good, deep, solid look in the mirror.